Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and joining me today is Susan Borison of YourTeenMag.com. Hello, Susan.
Hi, we are Your Teen Media. If you want to just
Your Teen Media is the larger.
Yeah, the website is YourTeenMag.com, but we are Your Teen Media. Yeah.
Outstanding. Well, welcome to the show. Now, I've been working with Your Teen Media for a little while now, and we've been bouncing emails back and forth. So I know why you're awesome and relevant. But can you take a moment and just let our viewers know?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that we're awesome and relevant because it is so hard to raise teenagers. And there's some sense out in the world that parenting is a cumulative skill set. And if you have ever had a middle school child, you know that you landed somewhere that you don't understand. And it gets really hard when you don't anticipate that there's got to be a shift in your parenting style at that moment. So we are all about preparing you and giving you great advice from the best experts, and also letting you know over and over and over again that you are not alone.
And that's Your Teen Media. But how about you personally, Susan? What makes you awesome?
Oh, I have 5 really awesome kids. Does that count as my awesomeness?
Scoreboard. You've been working as an managing editor in this line for a while, which means you kind of have a vicarious expertise on all manner of teen topics. But when we were bouncing our emails back and forth, you decided we should land on communication as kind of a focus for today's conversation, which I think is really, really vital. It's the underpinning of almost every safety topic you can have with kids, whether it's communicating honestly about driving habits, whether it's understanding how to talk to somebody when you're mad and they're scared, and coming out of that with your relationship made whole rather than further fractured. It's such an important topic. So I think I'd like to start with, what is your personal philosophy in terms of communicating successfully with teens?
I think it'd be pretty hard to say that I have one philosophy. But what I will say, this is something that I stumbled all the time when people said it. When I heard experts speak, when I was part of a conversation with an expert, and they would talk about, have a conversation with your kid. And I always thought, that is my goal every single time. But conversation to me has 2 people participating, and I don't always have a willing partner. So I think that we have to kind of know that having a conversation with a teenager might not look like anything you've done with another human being. They might not be looking at you in the eye. They might not be answering you. So you have to be really clever about how you have these communications. And I don't mean in a manipulative way, I mean in an effective way. So the first thing I want to say is be very loose in your definition of what good communication with your teenager looks like.
Could you expand on that a little bit? That's very interesting.
Well, I think that there have been times where my best conversations was when I was driving a car and they were in the back seat. I mean, nothing works better than not having eye contact with someone when you want to have a conversation. So, other things that people have recommended is sitting at a sushi bar when you want to have a conversation with a kid. It just goes better. And sometimes it was that I was listening to conversations and they forgot I was there. I loved that. I'm a nosy mom and I loved that so much. But also it meant that I could have a conversation, kind of see the reaction in the back seat, and also know that there was time on my hand. Like they didn't have to respond right away. I didn't have to demand a response. So that to me is like, how do you get clever? And then there were other times where, I remember one particular moment where I knew things were happening. There was drinking going on amongst peers of my kids. And I didn't know if my kids were participating, and I didn't want to ask them directly. So I just said, how does it make you feel when you're around a group of kids who are drinking? And boy, I got a really big response to that. Like one I didn't expect. I didn't even know it was a good question. I knew I didn't want to hit it head on. And so really kind of thinking about what's your reason for asking the question and what's the best way with that child, because it's probably going to be different with each child, to actually have something happen between the 2 of you.
That makes sense. I know that in my own experience, the best conversations I had with my father, even now as adults, were on opposite sides of a board game of some kind, whether it was chess or Risk or whatnot. I think that, every kid, like you said, every child has different ways that you can reach them and communicate with them. But if there's a universal rule, it's probably that the worst way to start a conversation with your teen begins with, sit down, buddy. We need to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's so many ways around those conversations, but I think the first thing you have to do is really sit with the emotion you're having when you want to start a conversation like that, because they can enrage us. Not only can they enrage us, they will enrage us. And also, you know, there are these moments where we had ideas of what our kids were going to look like and what they were going to do and what risky behavior would look like in your family. And you covered all of the bases. Like, you made sure your kid understood what it meant to exceed the speed limit, or to try a cigarette, or to vape today. I mean, you laid it all out on the line, so you knew you were good to go. And unfortunately, there's another person over there who's growing up who isn't necessarily being most influenced by you. And there's a lot of peer pressure. So things are going to come your way that you're going to be outraged by, like, not my kid, never. And that's not a good way to start the conversation. And those things, and I would say this is a really good way to look at a conversation always, is that there's a time factor that's involved in how you have these conversations. So at the height of your rage is never the time to have a conversation. In fact, at the height of your kid's rage is never the time to have a conversation. So you can say to your kid, you know, I'm so glad you arrived home safely, and just leave it at that. And then you can address all the other issues that come along with it a few days later. But nothing good is going to come out of, like, you know, when the tension is rising and rising and rising, and you're going to keep going at it. It doesn't work in marriage. It doesn't work in parenting. It's just not effective. No one can hear what you're saying anyway. So I think the first thing I would say is to be, and I try to do this and it's really hard, but the first thing is to be your kid's cheerleader. So wherever you can, you embrace them with love. There's going to be consequences out in the world for them all the time. And it doesn't prevent you from having a discussion with them at another time. But in the moment, if you can embrace them, and sometimes I really worked hard at embracing them when I least wanted to. And, you know, just trying to really let them know that I'm just so grateful that they're home and that they're safe, and whatever else I want to let them know. But that didn't leave them off the hook. That was not like, and you have no consequences. It just meant, I'm so grateful that you're here and you're safe. And then, you know, they're nervous about what's coming down the pike anyway. They know that they're not off the hook. But then you can say, like, when's a good time? I really want to talk to you about this. And it will be such a different conversation. You'll have time to think about how you want to approach it. They'll be a little antsy about what's coming down, and it'll be much more productive.
I think that's a mistake a lot of parents make. And I know that I've made it myself, that idea that when that kind of crux point of some kind of crisis with your child or your teen, that the conversation has to happen right then in the middle, when, as you say, everybody's emotions are up. Nobody's being their best self. And your child's one of your biggest, I feel like when the teen comes home after having made a mistake, there is some little nagging voice in the back of their head about, did I screw up bad enough that they don't love me anymore? Is this the time that I did that? And if we can answer that with resounding no, as you pointed out with that great line, I'd not heard it, but I'm going to be using it with my youngest, who's entering his teenage years, about, hey, I'm glad you're home safe. We will talk about this later, but not tonight. Yeah,
I mean, the truth is, I've had a chance to mess up many times since I have 5 kids. And someone asked me today, what would you say is the biggest difference between your first and your last in raising your kids? Obviously there's a huge difference, and anybody in a big family will tell you that the older kids thought we didn't parent the youngest kid, but we parented very intentionally. We just parented differently. And I would say that what became most important to me was the relationship with my kid. So that was always very much at the front of, like, the North Star of how I was going to go. I was looking at the end goal all the time to make sure that we were at the end left in a relationship, because the world is going to be hard. If they cheat in school, for example, and get caught, there's going to be a consequence at school. They already know that. But I want to be a place that they come to when something isn't working, when they are really struggling, suffering. I want them to know that I'm safe to come to. So that has meant, and I don't even know where I summoned up the energy to do this. That has meant apologizing when it wasn't my fault, because I could see the relationship. I could see the other kid digging their heels in on some principle that was going to take us down a very bad path. And I've done it, and it's, the first time's hard. The first time is like, I can't even believe I'm saying I'm sorry to a kid who was such a jerk. But what it did was it allowed for us to continue the conversation. And if I kept saying, you're a jerk and you're wrong and you need to apologize, it was just going to really fracture our relationship.
And that apology really has a lot of power. First of all, as you say, it can help get the conversation back on track. And it's also just good modeling. That we're showing that we can take our ego set aside and apologize, because a relationship is more important than the point of principle that's being debated. And if we model that well, that's a skill that will serve our teens for the rest of their lives.
I love that idea. And we talk about modeling all the time. I can't say I've witnessed a direct correlation to my behavior and their behavior, but I also feel like you never know. Like, I have seen things with my kids where it's not reciprocal. Like, what I do to them doesn't come back to me, but then I've seen them act that way with each other or with another relationship. So you may not benefit from like, oh, Mom, I'm so sorry, I was moody yesterday. Like, you may never hear that. But another way to look at it is, did you give your kids the modeling so that in their next relationship, they'll be able to do it? So the jury's still out of my house, but it works for my primary goal, which is to keep the relationship open and safe and loving.
And in that moment, shameless plug, but right now as we're recording this, I'm about to release the e-and-print book copies of an anthology I've been working on for almost a year on violence prevention, where I interviewed martial arts teachers, bouncers, spies, bodyguards, police, about times that there was a fight coming that they avoided through using verbal skills, intelligence, and whatnot. And one of the through lines through that, the number of times that what they did was they interrupted the script that the other person had in mind, where they got that record scratch moment. One example being a police officer who was being recorded aggressively by a few people and said, hey, I got a question for you. How's my hair? And it just was so goofy and unexpected that the person just laughed and calmed down, and then they were able to manage situations without anything escalating. And I feel like that apology from a parent will do that to so many teens when things are amping up, because adults don't apologize to kids. It completely record scratches their expectations and their script for how this conversation is going to go. And you get that, wait, what moment? And then you can more easily steer the conversation in a productive direction.
That's great. First of all, I didn't know I was feeding you anything, so I'm so glad you got to plug your book. But it is true. I mean, we don't want to ever be the ones to escalate the problem, and we will. I mean, undoubtedly we will. And the story I told before was about apologizing when I didn't think it was my fault, but there was ample time to apologize when it was my fault, and I got better and better at that. It was not easy, but I did get better and better at it, because we are all going to make mistakes. You know, I do it now, even when a kid has a crisis and calls and I get it wrong. And I just, I text them, love texting. I text them and I say, I'm so sorry, I got it wrong. And they're just so relieved to hear that, because they were looking for something from me that I didn't understand, and I got it wrong. So.
Yeah. And that brings up another great topic, which is texts. I also love texts as a parenting tool.
Yeah, no, I use it all the time. I think it's so safe to kind of, and I actually think we should learn the reverse from texting. We should talk this way also. Like, there have been times in real life where I have dumped an idea on a kid and walked away. I think the biggest mistake I made, or one of the biggest, because there were many, as I've said, was that I thought if I talked enough and explained enough, I would get the other side of saying, oh, Mom, I totally understand. I'll never do that again. And it doesn't go like that. Like, you know, if your kid is pushed up against a corner for some behavior or the way they spoke to you, and you're like pounding and pounding and pounding, you know, you'll never talk to me like that again. I will not tolerate this. it really isn't going to, it's not going to resolve then. That's just not the time it's going to resolve. But I have said things in kind of a, as I'm walking out of the room, gently saying something I want them, like a wisdom that I have that they are not interested in hearing. I might just say it on the way out of the room with no expectation of a response or a conversation. And those have come back to me when we later times where they said, I appreciated what you said then. And it's like, I can barely remember saying it. I had so many other times that I was like pounding my point. And then sometimes the most effective was just sharing my thoughts on a topic on the way out of the room, clearly no expectation of a response, and moving along.
And I've also found something similar with my adult child and the late teens into the 20s. It's a really good way of just reminding them that you're thinking of them, even though they're out having their life in another town. Just a little text about, hey, I watched that episode of that show that we laughed so hard at that one time, or a meme they might find funny. And just that little trickle in of affection and acknowledgement that's so easy to lose track of when everybody's trying to be a busy adult.
And you can't keep hounding your kid. Are you okay? Are you okay? How's everything going? What's going on? And so that text of like thinking of you, or, checking in, or saw something funny. It's just, it does make you feel connected. It really does make you feel in a relationship with your kid.
No, I absolutely agree. I wanted to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier about those more fraught conversations. And you talking about how getting in touch with your emotions, feeling, acknowledging and recognizing your emotions, especially when we're angry with our kids. Guiding principle that I've often lived by with my own emotional regulation is that anger is fear dressed up for Halloween. When we're angry with our kids, most of the time it's because they scared the crap out of us. And one of the ways that I found that is often helpful, so as not to let the anger build and build and build, is to acknowledge that fear and figure out, okay, what am I afraid of? And how can I make this conversation avoid or at least forestall that fear?
I think that anger is never anger, right? We know that there's something else going on underneath it. So being self-aware and sitting with that for a little bit is always the best, giving yourself some time to kind of decide how you want to respond. But also, getting it wrong the first time doesn't mean you're done. So if you do respond and your anger gets the better part of you, and even if it kind of goes south and you went too far, you still can the next day say, I'm really not happy with the way I handled that, but I do want to have this conversation again. So, I think all the time how forgiving parenting is. Like, you really get to make a host of mistakes. And why wouldn't you, especially if it's your firstborn, you've never done this before, you're going to get it wrong. And then you have the opportunity to get it right. So don't leave it hanging when you're feeling terrible about how it went. And the other thing is, once you do settle your emotions, as you said, when you become a little self-aware of what was driving that, having the conversation with your kid about what is driving your reaction is really healthy. Like I have said, I feel really uncomfortable with you going to this thing, whatever they were going to. And it doesn't mean I'm getting my way. It doesn't mean they don't sneak out and go on their own. But I want to be clear that what I'm worried about is, for example, our biggest worry, your safety. And so if I can get to the point where I know what's worrying me, I can now have the conversation with clarity and let them know where I sit on this whole story. Sometimes it gets the outcome I want, not always, but sometimes. I wanted to bring up another thing, how we ask questions of our kids is so important. And again, so much of this is about self-awareness. Like, why are we asking? So when our kids come home from school, like my kids would be like, back away, mom. How was school? How'd the test go? Who'd you sit with at lunch? How's that friend going? And they could barely answer the question before I was on to the next one. And it is annoying on the other side. Like, I would not want to be met at the door with that. So I have to really think about, for that example, I'm just missing them. I missed a whole day of their life and I kind of want to be brought into it. They don't want me to. So I have to really step back and say, okay, so if I'm going to be a welcome place for them to come after school, after a rough day at school, maybe I don't ask any questions. Like maybe I just say, hey, I'm in the kitchen. Like I've heard experts say this, which I think is awesome. Be busy when they come home from school, be in the kitchen, be making dinner or even cookies for snack or something. And then just say, hey, I'm in the kitchen if you want to come in. And that way they can take a moment if they need to kind of calm down. And you're also going to change the dynamic of what would have been if you greeted them at the door, with this so I do think that we have to be careful not to fill in their whole day that we missed and just spot them when they walk in the door. And then the other thing is when our kids come to us for help, like, for example, in my house, there was a lot of, would you read my paper? And so one of the things that I heard from like really many experts that I loved was ask them, do you want me to redline this paper or do you want me to just read it? And they were really clear on what they wanted. So like they would say like, oh, actually, no, I don't really want you to edit it for me. I want you just to read it. And that's the same thing held true for, coming in and saying a host of questions that they would ask me that I kind of felt like, that feeling when you're like, you're going to get it wrong. So just saying, yeah. Like we all know that, right? So just saying, before we go down this path, what are you looking for from me? Like, do you want my advice? Because I'm happy to give you advice. Or do you just want me? Are you really asking for support here? And when you can get those questions into your head, they become so easy and they're so instructive, because why waste my time with 15 minutes of advice that eventually irritates my kid when they really just wanted me to say, you're awesome, or you handled that really well, or whatever it is.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's an important kernel of any kind of communication style that we have with our kids, about walking into the conversation, either knowing ahead of time, what is the goal here? Or with your first goal being, what is the real goal here? Do you want my help or do you want my advice or do you want my support? Is a huge distinction that, I have trouble remembering to do that with my wife, let alone my kids, but it's important.
Yeah.
And what kind of support do you want? Do you want me to be just shut up and listen? Do you want me to be the great course in the background? Oh, no, he did not. Or do you want, what is it you need? Do you need ice cream and a hug? What do you need?
Right. And is there some way I can help you? That's also a good one. The other thing I'll tell you is that when in my family, I could get an entire story where I'm listening and going, are you insane? Like, did you really say that? Did you really do that? Like the whole story to me falls on my kid doing something wrong. But I am clear from my kid telling me this story that they want someone else to be wrong. And I give it to them. My first response is, that really sucks. They were a jerk. And then what I love is when that kid comes to it themselves and maybe a day or two later says, maybe I was wrong. Because if I come at them with, I think you were wrong, they're so thrown. We've all had this experience ourselves. We tell someone a story and we're looking for support. And they say, there's this kind of like hedging of like, I don't know, I think maybe you were wrong. And it's like getting hit. Like there's this physical reaction. Like, you just took me off course. I was looking for this and you just totally took me off course. And I don't even know how to respond now because I thought I was going to get love and I'm getting criticism after just having gotten criticism, right? Like, so even though a lot of these things sound counterintuitive, like your kid comes to you and they might even tell you, I was cheating on a test. And what do we want to say? Why the hell were you cheating on a test, right? Like, what kind of a kid did I raise? How is it that you did this? And if instead you said, a lot of people get caught doing things that are wrong, and I'm really sorry that was you today. And, something comforting that is hard to get out of your mouth because you have these other things up here that want to come out and say, what? And then there'll be another opportunity. You'll make it, they'll make it, where you're going to say, how are you going to handle this next time?
Yeah. Well, in some ways that gets back to Maslow, right? Where the child who recognizes that he shouldn't have cheated on the test, and he felt the need to cheat on that test because he had poor time management skills for the 2 weeks before the test, and put all those together, that's very higher order thinking. And that requires feeling comfortable, feeling safe, feeling loved, feeling personally powerful. And those things come from a parent who loves them first and corrects them second.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true for us too. I mean, don't we want to be held and told that that really sucks? Like, I don't know, but I don't know about you. I've made mistakes in life, and I've even had to account for mistakes in my life. And if the people at home weren't supportive, that would have been unbearable. So, you know, looking at myself as a mom to take away some of this kind of double jeopardy concept in law, like you get in trouble in school and then you come home and you get in trouble. I tried not to do that. I thought they're already seeing consequences. They're already internalizing that they did something wrong. And more at the core is, why did you cheat? Like, that's the better question to have, not why did you get caught or you're a bad person, but let's talk about, why did you cheat? And is there something we need to change? I mean, maybe it's over the kid's head and they can't figure out how to get the material and they need some help.
Maybe you need to call the uncle who's a physicist, or fire up Khan Academy online.
Yep.
Or whatever it is. I think that's one distinction that's very hard to draw, especially when we're angry or concerned in the moment. That difference between, you screwed up, kid, and you were in a screwed up situation. And first of all, if we can focus on, you were in a screwed up situation, that makes it easier to be supportive of the person, even when we can't support the decision. And then second of all, it opens up a conversation about looking at that situation and seeing how to avoid it next time.
Yeah, I like that. That was great. And just to shift a little bit, like, we know there's all these conversations that we need to have that make us uncomfortable. I mean, at your teen, we talk about these all the time. We talk about drugs and alcohol and sex, and the responsibility on parents is so expansive, like how many things you have to worry about, how many things you should talk about. And one of the really great tools for parents is to use media as your friend. So you are watching, I mean, I think that one of the best shows is Sex Education. I don't know if you've seen it. It is unbelievable. And it's about high school kids, and it's a little bit to adjust to in the beginning. There's a lot of sex, but if you talk to anybody in sex education in real life, they think the show is unbelievable, as did I. And so if you don't have to watch it with your kid, but let's just say you both watch the same episode and you're able to say to them, like, wow, I didn't even know that. Or do you know anybody in that situation? Whatever it is, it gives you a starting point based on a fictional character, instead of like facing them every single time you hear about a story and having these difficult conversations.
See also Big Mouth on Netflix, the animated show.
Nick Kroll, right? Yeah,
really vulgar, but wow, they're frank and honest and factual discussion of everything from body changes during puberty to consent. It was impressive. It's the kind of thing that if I taught middle school health, I would probably be fired for making the kids watch the show. But it's the same concept.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, do anything young adult, read a book together, do anything young adult, and you're going to have a conversation about gender identity, sexual orientation. It'll hit the gamut, because that's what young adult books cover. And then you can talk about it. You could have a family book club and just talk about it.
Ooh, that's a great idea. Yeah, my youngest is he hasn't quite gotten old enough that he thinks it's lame to read with his parents, but that day's coming. I'm not naive enough to think otherwise. But a family book club, I'm gonna write that down.
And tell them you heard it from Sue Borison.
From Sue Borison of Your Teen Media. Heard it here first, kids. So one thing, I had a thought, then my train of thought just derailed, but it was, actually, no. I'll get back to that.
I'm so relieved. That really makes me so happy.
Yeah. I've been hit in the head a lot. It's my only excuse.
Okay,
I used to be a boxer and not a very good one. But we were talking about kids. We were talking about conversations brought on by shared media experiences, by things we see in the news, for example. Oh yes. So you're having your conversation with your child and your teen, and things are getting out of hand. And it's happened to every parent I know of when the teen just blows up. And for some, that might involve, physical throwing of things, or just throwing the nastiest word or sentence they can at you, or because they've known you their entire lives, they know exactly the thing to say that gets exactly to the heart of your worst insecurity, and they just dig in and twist. And it's our job as parents not to rise to the bait, but it's very, very hard. So what are some ideas, some techniques that that you've heard of or used well to not let that get in when they take their best shot?
Okay, so physical danger I can't speak to. I think probably there are times where people do have to call the police. But what I can speak to is certainly experiencing kids blowing up. And it is really unnerving. And I know that I don't know that we're the same generation, but for people who raise their kids who are parents of teens right now, that they would say to their kids, you will not talk to me like that, right? Like, and this generation, we empowered our kids to talk like that. So they will talk to us like that. We said, we want you to feel confident in the world, and we want you to talk to the doctor when you go to the doctor and tell them what's going on. We gave them voice, but sometimes we think to ourselves, I didn't want it at me. I wanted it outward looking, but not inward. And so I would say one of the best pieces of advice, and I know people still disagree with this, but it has worked really well for me, is to let them say things that I think are appalling. Like, I don't mean invite it, but I mean, don't call them on it. Because why are they going there? Because you have taken away everything else that gives them autonomy. And their last chance is to walk away and swear at you, say, I hate you. And it's just a little moment of them grasping at some kind of strength for themselves, some kind of dignity for themselves, because you've taken it away. And overlooking that has changed everything. Because I was that parent who said, sit down, you will never talk to me like that. Give me your phone, you'll never get it back again. All of these like nevers, evers. And I was given advice by one of our therapists who we've used as an expert at your teen, that was, best you can overlook it. Just let that, what does that in fact do? What does that mean that they said that? And have a little sympathy at that moment for them. Daniel, what is his last name? Daniel Siegel. So he has a story, and his is not about language, but he's a very prolific writer of parenting books and psychologist and well-known. You should check him out. One of the things he said in an interview was, your kid comes home from school, they slam their backpack on the ground, they slam some doors shut and open and shut, and they walk in the door aggressive, and you don't like it. And so what do most of us do based on how we grew up is to say, pick up your backpack, stop slamming the door like this, this don't, basically change who you are when you walk in the door. And his point is, they've had a rough day in school and they are coming home to safety, and they're ridding themselves of whatever they can. They're making a statement that today was really hard. And maybe what we can give our kids is some time. So it looks like you had a hard day today. Why don't you come talk to me and say hello to me when you've settled down? I'm happy to talk to you later. But not this, when they're screaming, the last thing we should do is try to scream louder. And that backpack on the floor is a scream. And then we start, making it more and more and more. And the consequences worse and worse and worse, where we do have the power to just say, it seems like you had a bad day.
That gets back to what you were talking earlier about remembering the goal of the conversation, because we're having a conversation, it's about a fraught topic, and all of a sudden the kid whips out an F-bomb, and we call them on that. Now all of a sudden we're arguing about the usage of the F-bomb and its appropriateness in conversations and the dynamic between generations, instead of talking about the thing that we were talking about. It's a distraction.
Yeah, well, so when my oldest was little, the parenting advice was to give your kid a timeout. And my husband and I are both stubborn. We have 5 stubborn kids. That kid would never sit in the timeout chair. So what would we fight about? Sitting in the timeout chair. And at some point, I just realized we are so missing the goal of what we're trying to do. We are constantly fighting about abiding by our order to sit in that timeout chair when something actually happened that we want to address. So I think it's the same thing. Like, make sure we're not giving them an opportunity to derail the real purpose of the conversation.
And I think that opportunities are really good word to use there, because teenagers are the cleverest little morons on the planet. And they know if they can get you just this angry, then they're off the hook for that conversation that they were avoiding all this time, because now we're having this other conversation. And consciously or unconsciously, we'd be naive to think they're not doing it on purpose sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I hadn't thought of that one. I'll have to think back on those years and wonder when they did it on purpose.
They are clever little morons, those teenagers. You also brought up a thing I think is important about when they are using language or a tone of voice to push back against the authority figure who is you. There's this whole species of behaviors among teens and tweens and even younger kids that falls for me in the category I describe as behavior that will serve you well as an adult, but is going to be a huge pain in my ass until you're out of this house. So what am I going to do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what I was saying in terms of talking back to us, is that we have done a great job of giving voice to this generation. I mean, look at the kids today who are trying to make like global change. Yeah. And that's because we've given them a voice. There's no longer sit and wait until you're older. You have something to say, you can say it now. But it also does mean that they're gonna be bold in ways that we don't want toward us. So I did have an incident with a kid one time, and I called a therapist and I said, my kid is crazy. And the therapist said at the start of the conversation, she said, well, you don't want to take that out of her. You don't want to take that kid who fights for what they think is right and take that out of her because you don't want to direct it at you. Let's think of another way to handle this. And first of all, what I realized is that my kid didn't need therapy, but I did. And I think that happened lots in my parenting years, where I thought it was the kid that needed to change. But in fact, as we learn as we get older, we're the only ones that have control over changing. And the real thing in that story was, how do you say that there are boundaries to what you can do in the world, but that still don't let go of that passion and that self-respect and that defend yourself. That's all great, but also you could do it a little gentler.
I feel like a lot of parents in our generation have had the conversation with their child about, I raise you to be an independent person who questions authority and reaches their own decisions and is confident in their decisions. How dare you question my authority with your confident decision?
Yeah,
I feel like we've been on the wrong end of that conversation with our kids.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It's, I do want to send a kid out in the world very bold and audacious, but also, these are the rules in my house. And you're breaking them.
My mom used to say to me when I was about 16 to 18, angry with the world and everything, just, hey, Jason, if you shoot yourself in the foot every time somebody's an asshole, you are going to run out of feet before you run out of assholes. And I see that kind of thing in parenting a lot, where, that they've got that, they have the independent spirit, but they're not choosing their battles well. And so finding out how to coach them on how to choose their battles while still maintaining, nurturing that independent mind, that fighting spirit.
Yeah. And also I would say that a lot of these things don't have a goal. They don't have a destination. It's lifelong. I mean, they're, however old your kid is right now, they only know what they know for the years they've lived. And if you've had 30 years longer than them and you're still working on it, there's no expectation that this kid is going to arrive at something. You're just hoping to move them in the right direction along a journey.
I think that gets back to, you used the word forgive earlier, in terms of forgiving ourselves for not necessarily getting it right on the first time. You know, there's a lot of parenting resources out there, but it's a rough draft. Our first kid's a rough draft, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. It is true. We have a parenting Facebook page, working hard to raise teens. And so parents support each other. It's really actually a very lovely space. And someone put out there a decision she had just made for her kid, and she was feeling like she was making a mistake that could ruin her kid's life. And the thing that parents were saying is there's very little we can do in our decision making that can't be undone. You can make a mistake today. It was about homeschooling this kid who was having trouble socially at school. So you do it for a year. And if it doesn't work, you send your kid somewhere else the next year. Like, these are not decisions that are going to ruin your kid for life. So to me, that's kind of grace for me, knowing that I can get it wrong and still raise good humans.
And knowing we can get it wrong, and also giving ourselves permission to go learn, to ask for help, and things like a good Facebook group. Or you had mentioned therapy earlier. You know, therapy has such a bad rap in our culture. But one of the things that therapists have that we don't is experience, vocabulary, and tools. And so it can sometimes be really helpful to think of going to a therapist as a parent as going to parenting lessons. I mean, I'll go get lessons for something as trivial as cooking and playing the violin. There's parenting lessons right there available for us.
So I actually think that that we might live with some bias against therapy for ourselves, but based on the number of kids who are dealing with depression and anxiety right now, and how hard it is to find a therapist, I think we may have taken away the stigma for our kids. Like, if our kids are suffering, I think we do look toward mental health care workers. That might not be the same for us. We might not be doing it as readily, but I think that it's a really good change that's happening right now. It's terrible that the kids are suffering so much, but it's a really good change that people are looking for third parties to help.
You know, there's some other evidence there too. You know, I've been a professional writer for a long time, and I've always been fascinated with language. And one of the interesting things is the evolution of the words you can't say in public. Like, you know, several generations ago, it was blasphemy, things that were upsetting to religious people. And then it was all the words about sex, right? Back in the 60s and 70s, dropping F-bombs and stuff that we'll often use. And then for folks our age, it's mostly the racial slurs or the other kinds of slurs. But for kids these days, it's mental health. It's words like spaz and retard that are the big bombs. And I think that's evidence of what you're saying, that kids these days are very aware of mental health issues and much less judgmental about it and much less stigmatized about it. And I think that's fantastic.
It is fantastic. I'll tell you that we get called on it all the time when we say something casually that we didn't even realize was insensitive, but our kids pick up on it right away and call us on it.
Good. And I think that actually says something good about our generation of parents, not to pat ourselves on the back too hard, but the kids seem overall to be pretty darn cool, pretty good people. Better than us at any rate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love teenagers. I think teenagers are amazing. I still think it's hard to parent them. I mean, you know, I think that one of the biggest challenges is that you have a newborn baby and you're given the message that this is unformed clay that you're going to mold into something beautiful. And somewhere along the way, you're not the potter anymore. They are the potter for their own lives. And we don't actually have a moment. We don't have a ceremony. We don't have a time where we say, because it's different for every kid and it's different for every family, but there's this kind of graduation where you're out of that story and they're forming themselves. In my house, I always felt like when they got their driver's license, I became just a suggestion. Like there was and I could wield certain powers that I didn't want to, like hand me the keys, you'll never drive again. but there otherwise was very little power over what they could do and get away with without me even knowing about it. So, it's like, how do you learn how to have this huge responsibility to shape a good human, only to then start to not do that because it's on them to do it?
One of the most succinct expressions of that I ever heard was that transition from authority to influence. And we've been talking about it. The way we communicate with those teens is the way that we maintain that influence as we lose the authority.
Yeah, I mean, people call it consultant. There's like all very many ways of transitioning. And all of those they're good to hear, but they don't reflect the heart, which is it's near impossible to know when that time hits you.
Yeah.
It's typically much earlier than you think.
And even earlier than we want. Well, Susan, I really want to appreciate you for taking the time to talk to my viewers today. But before I let you go, what's the really smart question I should have asked you, but haven't yet?
How much time do I have to think about this? I guess you asked really good questions. So I think I said many of the things that I want to say, but what I want to end with is that, yes, raising teenagers can be really, really challenging and really joyful. So if you can understand how to hold those two things at the same time, that 1 minute can be so joyful and the next minute you really don't know what to do. You're so angry. And to know that they're both real and universal and part of raising a teenager, and it's part of their growth to be one way 1 second and then entirely different the next second. But treasure the moments of joy.
And remember the joy and lead with love, as you said at the very beginning. And that can help us manage the fact that we also kind of want to choke them for about 5 consecutive years.
I don't know. I have no response to that one.
I plead the fifth, Senator. Well, thank you again, Susan. And before let folks know where they can find you and your fine work.
Sure, yourteenmag.com. And we have, you'll see on the website, we have online courses. We have a podcast, Your Teen with Sue and Steph. You can listen to that anywhere podcasts or at your favorite podcast place. Every Tuesday and Thursday on Facebook Live, we interview an expert. So you can get lots of information there. You can ask questions during the interview. And you can find all those interviews on YouTube as well.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again. And thank you everybody for watching. Have a great day, whatever day you happen to be seeing this, and stay safe, everybody. We'll see you next time.